I think we all know that Moby Dick is considered to be maybe the greatest American novel ever written, and for good reason. But for whatever reason, we've never really seen movies that capture Moby Dick on screen. There have been some adaptations, most recently in today's podcast episode, In the Heart of the Sea, starring Chris Hemsworth from 2015. And the movie didn't do well at all. It did less well than Captain Ahab. It bombed at the box office. But that doesn't mean we can't use it to our own devices. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert. And every single week, we are talking about movies and the history behind them. And this week, we are talking about the Ron Howard-directed film starring the aforementioned Avenger. And we're talking with one of my absolute favorite historians working today. You're going to hear this today because I just love the book that she did. I'm talking about Bathsheba Demuth. She's a professor of history. She focuses on environmental history at Brown University. And she wrote one of my absolute favorite books, bar none, end of story, period, in Floating Coast, an environmental history of the Bering Strait. And if you haven't had the chance to read it, stop listening to this Actually, you know what? Finish listening to this podcast and then go buy the book and read it. It is breathtaking, marvelous. It is everything a history book should be. I can say this now because Bathsheba is no longer on the pod. I can embarrass her, which I plenty did when I raved about this book when we talk, and you're going to hear that today. But the pod we talk about today, in this pod, we talk not only about Moby Dick and this film In the Heart of the Sea, Nathaniel Philbrick's, based on Nathaniel Philbrick's real-life account of the sinking of the Essex, which inspired Moby Dick. But we also talk about whaling in general, the history of whales, what whales do for an ecosystem, along with Bathsheba's own work, working with Indigenous communities in the Yukon, talking about whaling, talking about watersheds, environments, and the general philosophy behind being a historian in 2024. And guys, this is the very first time Bathsheba and I had ever had a conversation, and it is one of the real pleasures I'd ever had to be able to sit down and talk to another scholar who I admire. It's such a great conversation, such a fun thing. So if you haven't seen this movie, it doesn't matter. Nobody saw this fucking movie. It's a great conversation. So I hope you sit back and listen. I hope you enjoy this. Bathsheba is one of the best historians working today, period. There's a wealth of information. I can't tell you how much and how excited I am for you to listen to the next hour or so. So with all that said, do I say it? Fuck it. There she blows. In the Heart of the Sea is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Are you anyway? Are you in Alaska right now?
I'm currently in Rhode Island, which is why I have two dogs in the room who may or may not make tons of noise.
Okay, that's fine. I have Buster right here who will, I guarantee, make tons of noise. So that's fine. So hey, how are you today?
I am good. It's a beautiful spring day here, finally. Flowers are blooming.
It's like 7 p.m. where you are. I was shocked when you were like, hey, let's do this late. Because usually everybody's like, I've got to go do whatever right now. So thank you for making the time tonight.
It gives me plausible deniability if I say something really silly. I can just be like, it was almost my bedtime. So I'm not responsible.
Usually when I'm doing this, I have a glass of wine in front of me. I do not right now. So I noticed. I was like, is it no fashion? What is that?
This is a busted pipe.
What is that?
It is.
I'm going to make it.
It's very good.
Hold on, I'm writing this down.
My husband
Busted
makes
pipe.
them, and this is his recipe, so I don't know if this is the standard. It's 1 ounce of Sazerac,
Okay.
1.5 ounces of Amaro, and 1.5 ounces of Kentucky bourbon.
You don't have to say Kentucky bourbon.
But it needs to be,
bourbon,
right? I thought you were a purist on this front.
I am. You don't have to say Kentucky bourbon because everything else is fucking heresy. Like, when I got out here to Colorado, they were like, we make bourbon. I'm like, you can go to hell. That's not what...
No.
And it's actually good.
I'm sure.
But it
right.
has to be, right?
Yeah.
And that's not even my part of Kentucky. That's from rich part of Kentucky. I'm from hill, in Kentucky, everything is centered around Lexington and Louisville and Frankfort. And if you're out west, I'm closer to Nashville, my hometown. They forget about my people. We're the hill people. We're the hills and farms. And they're coal mines and
Right.
horses
Yes.
and stuff.
Not the Appalachian junk.
No. But anyway, so you're okay. So actually, you're in the state. Like, I was just thinking about Nancy Shoemaker's book a second ago.
Yes.
Because,
Yeah.
right. I figured we would talk. That would end up coming into conversation because I was thinking you were in Alaska for some reason. Then you said Rhode Island. I was like, completely different water state.
They have weirdly a lot in common. Not geographical size, obviously, but they both have very few people in them compared to other states in the United States. So they're like low population states with lots of coastline. And other kind of bizarre, unexpected connections, some of which come out of the whaling industry, actually. But
yeah, I kept thinking, well, when you said Rhode Island, I was like, oh my gosh, it's perfect. Let's talk about all the places. And that's the cool thing about this movie we're going to talk about today is like they do this whole circle around thing. And we talk about like an Atlantic, Pacific, these hunting grounds and stuff like that. And I obviously want to talk to you tonight so much about native whaling and things like that because I think it's one of the difficulties they had in selling this film.
Yeah, that is not a piece of this particular story.
Yeah, like, okay, we'll get it. Before we start talking about the movie and things like, let's talk about you. You introduce yourself and like what you do while you're here tonight, aside from your love of Kentucky bourbon.
Yes, that's the important piece. So what am I? My technical title is very long. It's ridiculous. I am the Dean's Associate Professor of History and Environment and Society at Brown University.
Oh my gosh.
So that's a mouthful that I try not to say too often. And I'm an environmental historian. And most of my work focuses on the Arctic and subarctic. So back when it was possible, I worked in Siberia, far northeastern Siberia a lot, and in Alaska, and now in northwestern Canada.
Okay. Is this the part where I get to embarrass you?
Sure. I'm from Iowa. I embarrass easily. So.
Okay. First of all, oh my gosh. I can't tell you how much I love Iowa. One of my best friends is from there, in Iowa City. I swear to God, it's one of my favorite places.
It's gorgeous. Yeah.
Like
totally.
It's such like a college town.
Hidden gem. Flown over gem.
I swear to God, I am not making this. I went to school in Minnesota. Like they like have a thing with Iowa, and I'm like, those people are nice. That's like the Shire, It's
yes.
It's like lovely. There.
I actually do come from the Shire. Like I come from this tiny town called Decorah. It's in the Mississippi River Valley technically, so it's all hilly. It's not flat. That's where I grew up.
So then naturally, you're like, I will study the ocean.
Right. Let me flee this landlocked place.
I common. Yeah, well, dude, the second I saw the ocean in Florida, I was like gone. I did not go back to Kentucky. I was completely like back. All right, here's my embarrass you part. Ready? This is one of my favorite books I've ever read in my entire life. I'm holding it right. If you're listening, it's actually your book. Okay, I have to tell you this right now. And I use this book in really bad ways. And here's why. When people are like, tell me about your work and like the 3 books that influence my stuff, there are 3 books I talk about. Talk about Josh Reed, Seas My Country, because I love how he talks about space, the ocean and space.
Totally.
I talk about Dan Flores, as we've established, because I want to have a ponytail later on and talk about Wolfson. And I talk about your book. Because I love how you situate yourself in this. And I want to talk about this later on, because the prose in this thing is just like, it's butter is what it is. If I were right. See, also, like, I'm looking at the back here, like, you've got John McNeil, and you've got like Jack Davis. I would listen to The Gulf when I was writing earlier and stuff like that because it's so good. And Mosquito Empires is the funniest history book I've ever read in my life.
100%.
Like that droll humor he has.
That whole chapter about medicine, when you're like, you are just punking these guys.
Oh my God, you get it.
They've been dead for so long, and you are still at them.
He is hammering away at them. He's talking about like how, okay, for you, those of you who haven't read Mosquito Empires, first of all, how dare you? But there's this great bit in there where he's talking about like people who get yellow fever and malaria and all these different ways to cure these people. And he's like, they finally do themselves a favor and die.
Yeah, I didn't know you could be that acid in a history book. I was like, okay, permission granted.
Oh my God. So anyway, so when you reached out, I was like, are you effing kidding me? Yes, absolutely. Because I love this thing.
Thank you so much.
I want to talk about this book and your work.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for writing it. Because when I read it, I was like, this is cool. And I think it's part of when I see it, and I've talked about this book in the past, I've always talked about in terms of like what I want to see out of the field moving forward, because I think this book, and I promise not to like embarrass you too much, but like, I see this book is like what I want out of history.
Oh my God. Jason, I'm going to spontaneously combust.
The work you do. No, it's serious. Okay, don't do that. Don't die. I don't know anything about the firefighting capabilities of Rhode Islanders. Is that what they call it?
Yeah. Roadies. Rhode Islanders. Right. Yeah.
Did I get it right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So anyway, we'll talk about your book in a second, but first we have to, people are like, isn't there a movie involved? Not really. This movie didn't.
Sort of, kind of.
We're going to do it. Sort of, kind of. There's a book. There's a whale. There are whales in your book. We'll talk. And go from there. All right. So we're talking about In the Heart of the Sea, this movie that I didn't know was directed by Ron Howard until I watched all of it.
Yes, same. I was like, wait a minute. This is the Apollo 13 director.
Yeah.
How did we get to here?
I have thoughts on Ron Howard.
Yeah.
Ron Howard is America's safest director.
Yes. Yeah.
Did you watch Solo?
Uh-huh.
I think that movie was going to be really good until Disney freaked out about the way that Lord and Miller were going with it, because they were going to make this wacky Han Solo film.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And
interesting.
Yeah.
Oh man, that would have been such a different situation.
There are parts of it that are there, and you can if you go back and watch Solo, you can feel a vibe difference. Because they bring Ron Howard on halfway through after they fire Lord and Miller.
I don't know. It's like scraping the warts off something, right? Like you kind of want that difference and weirdness, and he just scrapes it right away. I
felt like if they had just gone like, hey, let's just own up the fact that this guy is not Harrison Ford, and just own it, right? Because I don't think how do you replace Harrison Ford?
Impossible.
How do you come
don't
in and
try.
say no, you can't, right? I thought it was a really good Chewbacca film, actually.
Yeah, I love a good.
We finally got
Chewbacca.
to see the arms getting ripped off.
Yes,
I met him once, Peter Mayhew.
That should definitely be in your bio.
It should be on the website. He was so unimpressed with me.
You can leave that out of the bio.
Most people are unimpressed with me, so it's fine. It's just a basic assumption. I was at Walt Disney World because I used to work there, and he was like signing some stuff. So I went up to him, I was like, gave him my thing. He's like, thank you, sir. He's like, okay. I was like, all right.
All right.
Thanks. It's just like, I don't care. I met Peter Mayhew. It doesn't matter. And Mark Hamill tweeted at me once. So I was like, all right, that's
bona fides there.
It made me feel good. There's a Star Wars stuff over here. All right.
Next time we'll do Star Wars.
You've listened to enough of these pods. We don't actually do anything related to history of movies at this point in time. Okay. So, all right. In the Heart of the Sea, you and I were talking because you were like, hey, I want, love to come on the pod sometime. And we're like, cool, let's pick a movie. And then we're like, shit, we've got Master Commander, which Mary Hicks already did.
Right.
And then what else do we
do? And this one does have whales. I almost thought about the Star Trek film where there's whales.
I thought about that one too.
So
will you come back?
Yeah, we could go back to that. I have vivid memories of that from childhood. So it would be good to revisit.
Oh yeah.
And this movie to me, one of the most surprising things about it is that I think this is the third time I've seen it, and I have a very difficult time recalling it right now. I mean, I finished watching it yesterday, and it just like slides right out of your brain. But it's this amazing story. Like the DNA of this movie is a whaling ship in 1820 that gets smashed by a sperm whale, and there's 3 boats of whalers that drift for weeks and weeks. Some of them end up eating each other before they're finally rescued. And this is what goes on, of course, to become Herman Melville's Moby Dick. So, I mean, can you imagine more drama in a story than all of those pieces?
Well, I mean, it's the reason why people call Moby Dick the great American novel, right? I mean, people argue that this might be the best novel ever made, right? Although when we have students read our own works, they'll often call our books novels.
So often.
That's an inside joke for professors, but yeah. What are we talking about? They're not reading. But it's this beautiful thing like I can do now that I'm not reading it. So I'm watching this movie yesterday too, because I usually like to watch it the day before, so it's still fresh in my memory. But with this movie, that's kind of impossible.
Yeah.
No lasting effect. And I'm looking at, I do some prep. I'm like, okay, let me look at the cast. This cast is ridiculous.
Unbelievable.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Chris Hemsworth.
You have half the MCU.
Cillian Murphy, who I watch in anything. I'd watch him read the phone book. Brendan Gleeson. It's an unbelievable cast.
Please. Tom, you got Spider-Man in this movie?
Yes, that's right.
Did you ever see Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter?
I have not.
That's the captain.
Oh.
That's George Pollard.
Oh, he would be good Lincoln, actually. Right? Like a younger Lincoln.
He was actually good. That movie's fun. And then there were, who else? I mean, this movie has like a lineup in it. And I was like, cool. You've got a great cast. But I knew going in when I was watching, I was like, this movie did not do well. And you're absolutely right. Like, there's no reason this movie, well, there is a reason, and we'll get to it. But it's like, you would think with this story that this thing would absolutely kill it, because it's such a captivating story. I mean, nothing goes right for these guys.
Nothing, no.
The ocean. It's just awful, right? So, I mean, you want to go back and watch this already? You could probably, you and I should probably watch this right now because we can't remember it. It's like, spoiler, this is not the movie people are like, oh God, I love this movie. It's like, actually, no, like, I love the story.
Yes.
Do we love the story?
I mean, the story is fascinating. I think if you are intrigued by the story, that Moby Dick is like the OG way to access it. And that if you can't take like hundreds of pages of Melville going on long digressions about whether or not a whale is a fish or a mammal, and various other, I mean, he has these amazing chapters that have nothing to do with the plot, which I personally think is a device that is underused, like, because it's just sort of a fascinating way of giving you this world building perspective. But there's also a book called In the Heart of the Sea, which is focused on the history of the whale ship Essex in particular, which is also it's a very gripping read. It's more dramatic than the movie. So I don't know.
Filbert can write.
Filbert can write, exactly. It's a very good, like, narrative driven, but it gives you a sense of the lives of these men, because they're basically all men on these crazy voyages going all the way around the world, alternating between incredible, intense, mind-killing boredom and, backbreaking labor and terror while they're hunting whales. So, yes, I would recommend accessing this movie via the page, I guess.
I guess just go back and read Moby Dick. Yeah. This way you can knock out your lit class too, right?
That's right.
Like, so here's the thing, right? But as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, wait a second, this movie is a slog to watch. It's utterly unremarkable in so many different ways. At the same time, I'm like, wait a second, I can curate the crap out of this movie. And as snippets, I can show this in a class. And you're like, wait a second. You want to talk about whaling? You want to talk about early 19th century life? You want to talk about life at sea? You want to talk about classism? Mm-hmm. They're like recut, in the HATM cut of this film.
We just need the masters so we can get in there.
Actually, what it is you and me just like sitting there and like interjecting. Like, actually, about that is this like we stop and we just jump in and we show up in costume, right. just transposed over the film. Like, hi, I'm Jason. I'm First Mate Herbert,
That's right.
And I'm here to show you
how this would be really done.
This is a top knot, whatever, like, so forth. Okay, so let's talk about the film, because it's like, are there parts of this movie? So going back and watch this, because I was like, all right, cool. This movie does do some things. I did kind of go, why didn't it just make Moby Dick?
Yeah, right.
I think Moby Dick sells better.
Maybe having an Ahab at the center of it would give it some of that tension that is not quite there in this one.
Well, there's a thing, right? Because I don't like Ahab, and I'm supposed to like Chris Hemsworth. So it like radically, it's. You want me to root against a whale, but I'm not going to do that.
Right.
In a movie, because I've seen Star Trek 4. Thank you. I know it's coming. Right. And then it's, and then also it's like, so with Ahab, it's like, okay, wait a sec. This man, this story is telling so many other things about his pride and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not rooting for him at all. I'm rooting against Ahab. In this case, like, who is my villain in this film?
Right. Because you don't want to root against the whale.
I'm not a bastard.
And, I did think one of the things I do like about this film is that one of the very last scenes, you see the whale, this is a spoiler, getting away. And it's clear that this whale has been through many encounters, right? It's just scarred up one side and down the other. And this is true of some of these sperm whales that had repeated encounters with whaling ships. And it's part of why they attack them, right? Is that they have learned how dangerous they are. So I liked that little nod to like the sort of character of the whale that otherwise I think could have been sort of brought to the surface more. Terrible pun, but ouch.
No, you're absolutely right. Like, well, because we know whales are sentient, right? And you like, and you talk about this in the book, right? It's like there are souls to these animals. And I remember as a child, like growing up in Kentucky, like only people have souls was the way I was like taught in the 80s. And like, that's, it's like only people are sentient. Maybe we'll put it in this term, right? Only people are self-aware. That's completely nonsense when you look in the eyes of a whale, or, well, maybe not my dog so much, but, Buster is a complete maniac. But it's like, he's like, he's asleep right now.
He's like, wait a minute, I'm quiet.
He heard me on the phone with the vet earlier today, and I was talking. I was like, "Can you give him a shot in the ass just something annoying?" Because I feel like I need to get even. And that's just not the case with whales, though. We know that these are among the smartest animals on the planet. We know they are capable of love and relationships and all these. And it's like, how do you root against this? Especially because the whole film is built around hunting these animals down and taking them for resources, right? To commodifying these animals.
And that scene early on when they actually do successfully kill a different whale, you get a sense of like how intense that job is and how much suffering is in it for the whale. And, that I thought that was realistically gory.
Well, I think so, right? I think when I watched that, I was like, oh, this is why the movie didn't do it.
Right.
Because who wants to watch whales get killed on screen? And look, I watch hunting shows. I watch fishing shows and things like that. Those things don't bother me as much. But also, if a hunter is hunting, say, a whitetail deer or something like that, a lot of these hunting shows, hunters are very ethical in the way that they do. They're trying to very much minimize the suffering onto an animal, like try to make a quick, clean kill of the animal to harvest it, things like that. That doesn't happen in a whale hunt.
No.
There's suffering, not just the suffering in like killing the animal with a harpoon or things like that. The chase, the stress, the anxiety of these animals. These animals know. These animals
They know they're in trouble.
These ships show up. Yeah. This is not a thing. So I was watching this, I was like, oh, this is a bummer.
It's a bummer. Yeah. And that's before the cannibalism. So
cannibalism didn't bother me. I was totally unmoved by that. I was like, yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do, man. I mean,
it is true. It's dramatized less too. Like it's sort of this moral moment for the characters. But
I guess my question with the cannibalism is: do you treat legs like wings? Do you go for the drum or the flat with that? I mean, there's no salt, so you got to, there's only so much you can do with that. You can flavor it with like a salt water.
I know.
I spent too much time thinking about things, I think. Okay, so you're talking about, right? And in Holland's character, we kind of see is kind of aghast at first.
Yeah. Yes.
Because you see this movement of like the excitement of the hunt through his eyes, like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, we're rowing up on this thing, and then the killing begins. And
and he gets sprayed, and and that's something that the whalers' logbooks, it does come through in some of them, that there's a sense of being aghast or being of a kind of like a moral wound at having to go out day after day and kill these animals. That the whalers were very aware were sentient and intelligent, and if you work that closely with any animal, even if it's to kill it, you're very aware of what's going on. So they were quite aware of the pain they were causing, and that it interrupted whales' social worlds too, because they had to observe that.
We see that also, right, with like when they show the cow.
Yes, I know.
And that was another part where I was like, oh God, this is awful. Like, I don't want to watch this movie anymore. Why does she make me watch this movie? Yeah, and I've read. I know what happens to the whales here.
That's right. It's bad enough on the page.
I'm somehow less traumatized by your writing. I was like, oh, well, they served a purpose. It's like, it's too bad. I know they're very old. But, I'm seeing a cow, and I'm like, unfortunately, like they let the cow get away. They kind of cut her loose, but that's because the white whale is just going ape shit on the Essex. All right, I have to ask you, like, do we see other, like, this is the most well-known instance of a whale deliberately attacking a ship and sinking it. Are these stories common in the record, in the archive at all? Do we see them elsewhere? Is this just like a localized thing, or are there other whales that are doing this as well? Throughout, like, what's going on with these animals?
So I know less about sperm whales because most of the whales that I hung out with were bowheads and gray whales, and they are less prone to attacking the main ship. But if you remember in this movie, there's like the ship that has the sails on it where they live, and then if they sight whales, they drop these things called whale boats, and that's what they chase the whales in, and those are much more vulnerable, and there are many cases of those getting flipped, and pretty clearly whales realizing that they're more vulnerable. the kind of sinking of the Essex is a pretty unusual event. Although there is the kind of very famous 2023 orca situation where the orcas are going after yachts, right? So, the idea that these are animals that learn where the danger comes from and either how to avoid it, which is more the bowhead technique, or how to kind of counter it with force, which is in some cases what sperm whales did.
Well, bowheads are not as big as sperms, correct?
It's not a size thing. They're not as fast, and they tend to be. They live. The sperm whales tend to be deep water whales. And you actually kind of see that in this film, right? They're sort of told that they have to go out to these grounds that are way out in the Pacific, not close to a coast, which is, of course, more dangerous for people, as we find out. And bowheads really like to hang around the edge of the sea ice. So what they learn to do is basically use the sea ice as protection, because nobody in a wooden ship wants to get terribly close to pack ice, because if the wind changes, it comes in and it sinks your ship for you. And you're done. And you're done in the Arctic. So it's not a treat in the South Pacific, but you don't actually die instantly. So there is more of a chance of survival in the South than in the North.
Yeah, you don't die instantly because the water doesn't hate you in Hawaii.
Right.
So, it's like,
not actually below freezing the way that it is if you're...
It's like not actively trying to kill you. It's like, look, like this land created polar bears. You are from Nantucket. You are not. Right. You are not going to do this. I'm wondering, a flashback to like Moby Dick, right? Ahab famously has had his leg chopped off, bitten off by Moby Dick, by the whale, right? And I'm wondering, do we actually see that elsewhere? Like, do we actually see attacks on actual humans when they're in the water by the part of whales? Have we ever seen that before?
I don't know of people getting bitten by whales, because they're often hunting baleen whales that can't bite because they don't have teeth. So sperm whales do have teeth and can actually bite you, and an orca could, but they weren't hunting orcas in the 19th century. But you definitely see boats getting sunk by whales, by their tails and their flukes, and lots of broken bones. That was the sort of being in the whale boat. And if your boat gets stove in by any kind of whale, the chances of your limbs getting in the way is pretty high. And I think the other big injury is actually if you saw the men coiling all those ropes quite carefully. Imagine your leg gets in the rope and then you're going for one of those Nantucket sleigh rides and the whale is pulling you out to sea. That can be pretty gnarly very fast.
Yeah, like the ship itself is a danger.
Yes, and it's full of incredibly sharp objects.
Sharp, pointy, heavy, like everything in the ocean wants to kill you.
Right.
It's just the way it is.
And then you fill your ship with refined whale fat that you refine on the ship with fire. So,
And your ship is made out of what?
Wood. So every now and then they go up in flames.
This is a great idea.
Nothing could go wrong.
We're going to take fuel on a wooden boat, this rotting island already.
Exactly.
That we're living on, and then we're going to store it, because this is a terrific idea.
Terrific. Yep.
I did like how they were showing the part of like, hey, this is how they do show that in the film, right? Where you're taking the fat and you're rendering it down into the fuel. And there's all these subtle things. Yeah, actually, have you read Jeremy Zalon's book?
Yes, I love that book so much. Yeah, such a good book.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you. Oh my gosh. I remember when I got it, I was talking to Brett Rushforth and he was like, dude, it's so good. I'm like, can I fucking read the book, please?
Yeah.
He's like texting me. I'm like, I can't read your texts
and the book
at the same time, Brad. Leave me alone.
I taught it to undergrads this past year, and they were like, are you kidding me about these pigs that were they were flabbergasted in the best way. They're like, history is this stuff? And I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah. I don't even know how to get him on the pod, because I'm like, how do I even make that into how do I pair that book with a movie?
Has anyone done Gangs of New York?
Yeah.
Oh yes, that's right. Somebody did do
Tyler Anbinder.
That's right.
The OG. He did consulting on that.
Yes.
On that movie.
Yeah, that's right. That was a very good podcast.
That's our best one. I was terrified of him. Our producer Fletcher, when we were doing the thing, he's like, usually you're joking around and stuff like that. He goes,
very straight-laced.
He goes, I've never seen you nervous around another historian before. And I'm like, yeah, it's like, because Tyler was like, he's kind of proper. He's more reserved a little bit.
And wrote this, helped write the script for this movie.
And so wonderful. Like, I didn't know him at all. The first conversation I ever had with him, much like what we're doing now, only like you and I talk on occasion. So it was like, I never was like, hi, we need to be friends. It's like, I too hit word, I do passwords in the Ireland. So yeah, so it was good. No, but I don't know what like I would do with like.
Yeah.
How do I even do that book? I don't even know.
I'll think about it because I would love to hear him. He's also currently working on, I saw him at ASEH this year, the environmental history nerd gathering annually. And I was like, what are you writing about? And he said, shit.
Wait a sec. Wait, the one in Denver?
The one in Denver.
I was at Denver and you didn't come say hi.
I was there.
I drove up there
for 20 hours. I was barely there.
I crashed that conference.
Yeah, it was not a good showing on my part. Okay. I had to fly in and out because of other stuff. So okay. I was en route to Alaska.
That's an awful airport.
Yeah, terrible.
The airport's in Kansas.
Yes.
Sorry. Well, returning to the film now.
Which is not about airports.
People are like, you do this every pod. Why can't you stay on topic? I'm like, you should. That sounds just like David Chang when he was reading my dissertation.
It's a long history.
He was like, why are there so many fucking Star Wars references in this? And I'm like, I can't help it. I have to be me. So anyway, all right. The other parts, like, the other thing I kept seeing was like, I felt they were a little heavy-handed with this. Did you, like, the whole idea of the classism inside of this? What were you thinking on this? I mean, they were very blunt.
They were very blunt. And it's not that there's definitely class issues on the ships, right? And the captains tend to come from a very different class and potentially the first mates than the green hands that just sign on because they need a job. But I did think it's complicated because I think some ships were run in ways that respected the fact that the only way to go out and kill a whale is to have it be a communal job, right? This is not a solo task. It's not even a solo task in the 20th century when people are using, fossil fueled boats and harpoons that are basically bazookas. Like, you just need a lot of people for this to work, and you need those people to work as a team. And I think some whaling ships ran those teams in an awful military discipline with lots of corporal punishment kind of way. And there's actually interesting legislation that comes in to try to reduce the corporal punishment because they could be so brutal. And the U.S. felt like this was a sort of uncivilized thing to be projecting out into the global oceans. But there's also cases where the ships sort of understood themselves as a collective that had to work as such, and do so not just across class lines, but race lines and language lines. And you see a little bit of that in this, and that it's not everybody on the ship is from the same background, but they're not kind of pulling in as many sailors as they might in the South Pacific. And
yeah, so I was looking at the crew diversity of the ship itself, right? Because I don't even know what Chris Hemsworth is supposed to be because his accent is.
I have no idea what that accent is.
Like, sometimes I'm like, are you from Queensland? Like,
well, he's Australian, right? So it sort of broke through sometimes.
It was like, I look at you. Yeah. I was like, oh God, it's so bad.
It's definitely not Nantucket, I can tell you that.
Not so much. And okay. And then, but like, also, there were people of African descent on these ships. Other scholars have actually shown like these were actually very diverse faces at times. And I was looking to see that. Yeah. We saw a couple black faces, black bodies on these ships, which I was happy about. That you can't accommodate everything. I get that. But I was kind of wondering, wait a second, this is 1820. Are these men enslaved? Are they free men at this point? Where are they picking these guys up at? Like, I don't quite know.
So it's an interesting this is something Nancy Shoemaker writes about and some other historians. And the whaling vessels were actually kind of a way to get away from slave catchers in the north. Like if you had made it as far as Massachusetts or Rhode Island and you were able to get on a slave ship, you were basically, free at that point, right? And many of those formerly enslaved people left somewhere before they came back to the United States for very obvious reasons. So that was kind of one source is people who were escaping slavery in the South, making it up to these port cities and were able to sign on. But they were also picking up crew all along these voyages, so off the coast of Africa, and then picking up lots of people kind of as they go up through the Pacific. So the first people from Hawaii to see the Arctic are moving up on these these whaling ships because they would sign on. And some of them got, sort of dropped off in the Arctic and end up staying there over winter, which, talk about somebody I'd like to talk to and get their perspective on things. And then, some would make it all the way back if you wanted to, go see what Massachusetts was like. So places like New Bedford were kind of wildly cosmopolitan. But working class cosmopolitan.
Right. And the other thing is, like, these guys, you talk about, like, the idea of, like, you can escape to the sea, right, here, and you can be safe from this persecution, and find some level of maybe equality on here. You're not the captain, you're not the first mate, but you've got a hand in your own livelihood. But these voyages are long. Right, like the idea is, like, you're going to be out till you accomplish the mission, and they kind of show us in the film the hunting grounds are gone even by 1820. Is that a thing where even by the early 19th century we're seeing whale populations drastically dropping worldwide already at this point in time? Is it well established at that point in time? Where I know about some of the fisheries off the coast of New England and so forth,
right.
But whales themselves also dropping because of whaling?
So whales are dropping, particularly in the Atlantic, where there had been hunting pressure actually at this point for quite a long time, because there's a European hunting tradition from the Netherlands and the kind of Basque whalers and the British that are going up, to the kind of between Greenland and Svalbard, basically, and hunting those waters. And then the New England whale fishery is hunting. They start with nearshore whales like Atlantic right whales, hunt those out pretty quickly and start going sort of further and further afield. So the kind of whole industry is moving as the whale populations either move or are depleted in various places. And at this point in the 19th century, they are not hunting a huge range of whales. There's like a moment in this film where they have like a picture of the auction for whale oil, and there's a thing that says like blue whale and humpback whale. It's like they weren't killing blue whales. Like, blue whales are the largest animal that ever lived. Like, how
do you kill a blue whale?
You have
insult it to death. We're like,
you have to. They were killed massively in the 20th century, right? But you need massive factory ships to do it, and they were definitely not being hunted. They're too fast and they're too big for these 19th century ships. So they're hunting right whale species and sperm whales and gray whales for the most part.
You just said this, like, I had never thought about a blue whale as far as in terms of speed goes, but it's so streamlined.
Yeah. And fin whales, which are slightly smaller, are super fast. Yeah.
Really? Okay. All right. I had never thought. All right. Are there parts of this film when we're looking at this that absolutely drive you nuts? If you remember this movie at all.
Yes. So, other than like having blue whale on the auction board, which is just like a silly, picky historian thing. I think the thing that really, when I saw it, I was like, oh, shoot, it's at the very end of the film. It's this kind of almost romantic scene where the character who is Herman Melville is talking to the character who has survived this shipwreck. And they kind of talk about how, well, you've heard about this thing, oil, right? That they're finding oil in the ground now. And the implication there is like, this is what's going to come and save the whales, essentially. And it's a big theme in the way that whaling, kind of popular whaling history is told. And actually a lot of whaling history is told is like, we find oil and the whales are freed, right? We have a clean energy transition. And it turns out that the majority of whales that humans have killed were killed by fossil fuel powered ships in the 20th century. Like 3 million whales were killed that way in the 20th century. That's the real slaughter. It's after this Moby Dick style whaling. And I was like, shoot, don't do that. It does not save the whales.
There's a sense that he, like, first of all, there's no way that Hemsworth is going to kill this whale. Is with his one,
right,
like,
his little harpoon stick.
He's like, oi!
Yeah.
This is why we're big in Australia. It's my accent. But he's like, oh, yeah, I spared him. It was like, did you though? And yeah, it kind of lets you off. You're like, oh, everything's going to be okay.
Yes.
And that's the reason why Greenpeace was never established. And the reason why
right.
Star Trek 4 didn't happen. And, it's like totally that nuclear testing we did in the ocean totally didn't have an effect on whale populations.
Right. Or modern day shipping, right. Or all these other things that are actually incredibly consequential for whales. Sonar, right?
I worry so much, like this idea of like what the ocean sounds like.
Yes,
with all of these ships running around, submarines, everything, just pinging the whale, everything. it's got to be like whale tinnitus.
There's these amazing studies that I can't do because I'm a historian, but I can read, that are done about using whale earwax, which is pretty ingenious because whale earwax builds up a little bit like tree rings. So it's
the world's biggest Q-tip.
It's the world's biggest Q-tip, and it is sequential chronologically in a way that's very useful if you're trying to get a sense of the life of an animal over time, because in that earwax are hormone traces throughout the whale's life, and you can date them year by year. And so you can look at a whale's earwax plug and see times when their cortisol levels go up and down. So their stress hormones spike or don't spike. And the times when their stress hormones go down were, for example, right after 9/11, when global shipping basically stopped. The seas got quiet, stuff stopped moving around at an industrial scale, and it was like actually, peace on earth for whales for a hot moment, right? It was clearly a terribly destructive, upsetting time in the human world in many places, but the impact on that for whales was the exact opposite.
Wow. The idea to think about earwax of all things.
I know.
I don't. How does one harvest whale? Are these deceased animals they're harvesting from?
I'm trying to remember. I think it's something. Sometimes they find them in stranded whales, but I can't remember. I think sometimes it's actually something that gets sort of shaken loose. But I'll have to check on that.
Yeah, sorry. The mental image is now of just a whale. Or you get those things that you see on like Instagram where they're like, buy this stuff, and
right.
You're like, do they make a whale-sized one? And if so, what does the ship that carries it look like? And who is licensed to operate the earwax 4,000 for a?
This is why natural science research is more expensive than historical research.
Okay, that's fair. All right, so here's the thing. Like, so much of this, and this is, you're actually just talking about, because I really kind of want to get into these whaling traditions and things like that, because there's, your work itself, talks a lot about whale hunting and things like that in indigenous communities. And what this means, and of course, like there are longstanding whaling traditions throughout the world and stuff like that. So I actually kind of wanted to kind of get into it. Maybe we'll transition. We'll come back to this movie in a second. Let's get into this thing that I embarrassed you about earlier, which is like, why of all things of the Bering Strait? Like, what your book is an environmental history of the Bering Strait. Like, how did you come to decide? Like, wait a second, this is the story I want to write, and this is why. And I also want to talk about like all the way down to the choice of the press and things like that. Like why this? I guess maybe let's start here. Let's talk about why the Bering Sea for you. Like why the Bering Strait for you? Like of all places you could write about, why here?
This is a very long story. So it starts before I knew what a professional historian was and that I wanted to be one. And it starts when I'm like a high school age person finishing up that stage of life, thinking about college. I think that college looks really expensive. And then when you're 18, committing to something for 4 years is like, that's a huge chunk of your life, right? I mean, when you're an older person, you're like 4 years, fine, whatever. But when you're 18, it's like, this is everything.
Made that decision recently.
It's a real big deal.
Sure, I'll go to Colorado. Right, go on.
And I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I convinced my parents that I should take what we would now call a gap year, but at the time had no such institutionalized, kind of legitimacy around it. And I put together with my like babysitting and summer work money this around the world itinerary where via a very ad hoc organization that helped people find kind of internships, basically, I was going to go to a village in the Yukon territory and train sled dogs. And then I was going to go to Costa Rica. And then I think I was going to go to East Africa and maybe somewhere else, like 3 months each. And then I was going to come home. And I still haven't been to Costa Rica because I stayed in this village in the Yukon for several years rather than a couple of months because I became so into training sled dogs, which you would note is a very long way from the coast, but I am getting there. It does connect to the ocean. And the village I was living in is called Old Crow. It's a Gwich'in village. The Vuntut Gwich'in government is seated there. So there's, maybe a half dozen white people. Everyone else is Gwich'in. And I had to learn how to run a sled dog team in a community of 300 people that's 100 miles from the nearest road and 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So I spent a lot of time negotiating very directly with the environmental circumstances around me, right? And so every preconceived notion that I had about who got to make the decisions in a day and whether or not my choices mattered really went out the window. Because if I imagined that I was in control of any situation, I'd probably die. And that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's really not. It's like, if you think that
not
way,
in Yukon. Right.
It really puts you in harm's way. You have to be very cognizant of all the other things that have power over you, like the bears and the weather and whether or not there's a hole in the ice and everything else. So I did that for a while, and it was living there that actually made me start thinking about this region as being connected. I was living just to the west of the Mackenzie River, just to the north of the Yukon River. But the first European goods that Gwich'in folks interacted with mostly came from the Russian Empire. So they were traded, they came all the way across Siberia, and then they're traded across the Bering Strait. And this is long before the Russian Empire has a foothold in Alaska. They're making their way across the Bering Strait through indigenous trade networks and working their way, all the way up the Yukon River and its tributaries up into this village, which is on a Yukon tributary I was living in. So I started thinking about the fact that this space was deeply connected with, what in geopolitical terms is now seen as very separate, right? If you're on the Russian side of the Bering Strait, you're in a totally different place. You're in a different time zone. It's a different day over there, even, like all of these kind of differences. But, historically, those were not operative, right? That this was a place of connection. And then ecologically, this is a place where, the two sides of the strait are virtually the same, right? They have the same climate. Most of the same species live on the two sides. And the ocean in between is, of course, everyone's moving back and forth all the time. So this idea was kind of humming around in there. And then through various ways and means, I ended up in graduate school, partly because all that time on a dog sled made me so fascinated by this kind of abstract question of how it is that the ideas we have about the world change it, and then how is it that the world comes back and changes what we think about it? Like what is that space of back and forth between the material and the ideal? And so I actually ended up in grad school to training as a Russian historian at Berkeley, because I was interested in how it is that sort of the socialist ideas come to take up space in the Arctic. And try to overcome, in some ways, the material constraints with the ideal that was, so strong and so passionately held by these kind of Bolsheviks when they arrive. But then I remembered that I'd spent all this time on the American and Canadian sides of the kind of Bering Strait area, and it didn't make any sense to stop it at that border, because nothing had stopped there in the past. The animals didn't stop there. People kept moving back and forth. So it sort of grew from a little Russian history project in grad school to actually having to cover out the whole strait again.
Did the project change? Wait a second. You said Berkeley. Did you work with Brian there?
Yes. Yeah, he was on my committee. Yeah.
Okay. I was like, wait a second. I was like, Berkeley. Okay.
Yeah.
Brian came on, and of course.
Yes. Yeah. Did the one with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah.
There Will Be Blood.
There Will Be Blood.
Yeah.
That's another fuel. Another
fuel movie.
Right. But yeah, okay. So I was like, wait a second. Shit. Now I lost my. Oh, okay. My question was this: did the project change very much from graduate school to its culmination as you worked to turn it into a book?
So, from dissertation to book?
Yeah, because you published through Norton.
Yeah,
and this is I love this. I fucking love that you went through Norton. I am. For those of you listening in right now, we're probably talk a little bit of academic inside here, but there's this big push at times, or I think overwhelmingly, to publish your first book through a university press. And this book, you went through Norton, arguably maybe the biggest trade press. Why did you feel like you were taking a gamble by going through Norton at the time or something like that? Or because I love that you did this.
Yeah. So it was kind of a calculated risk, and it was calculated. I had written the dissertation, which it's actually quite similar to the book. The dissertation had 5 giant chapters that are now 5 sections of 2 chapters each. So that's how I did the splitting, and there was lots of repetition and error and all sorts of stuff that thank goodness got filtered out of the dissertation. But because I was writing, there were no historians of the Bering Strait on my committee because there aren't a lot of those folks out there. They're mostly anthropologists. And B, I was at Berkeley, which doesn't have an environmental historian on the faculty. They're in the process of hiring one right now. I didn't know environmental history was a field until I was well into grad school. And so this is how I ended up as a place that that didn't have a person.
I fell into it.
Yeah, right.
Totally.
You're like, oh my gosh, I read Don Worster and now I'm hooked. That's what happened to me. So I was writing a book that was simultaneously for Russian specialists or a dissertation that was simultaneously for the Russian chair of my committee, Yuri Sloskin, and then for Brian DeLay. And, so Brian knows a lot about a lot of things, but the Russian Revolution is not his home territory. And Yuri Sloskin knows a lot about a lot of things, but like the New Deal isn't what he thinks about all day. Neither of them think about whales at all. And so I knew that there was a kind of, I had to be able to hook at least those two audiences, right? Who have nothing to do with each other. So I already had that writing challenge. And then I had this amazing and very clarifying conversation with a historian you may have heard of named Richard White, who told me early in grad school, he was like, don't write this book. It's like, flee from this project. Get the hell out of here. He's like, no one will ever read it.
Except for Jason.
It's like, no one is interested in this, no one's interested in this part of the world. Go write about somewhere that people have heard of. And I didn't listen to him, obviously. But I figured that inside that comment was something I should listen to, which is I have to make people care about a place that many folks aren't going to wake up in the morning thinking about. And so that to me is a craft question. It's a question of making the story interesting and the language compelling and the place vivid and all of that. So I had this, I had to write for two different sort of national audiences to begin with. And then I had like Richard White's voice in the back of my head, which was very useful. And I sent him an autographed copy when it came out. And I think that shaped the prose from the beginning. And then I felt like this book, if I could, should reach as many people as it could. And that meant going with a press that would, do as much to make it a solid book as possible, right? And that means editing, and it means, all sorts of things, like the team of people at a trade press that go into helping you make a book that's, beautiful to look at and to hold, and where the prose has really been helped by professionals, is really intense. So I wanted to do that and was willing to take a little bit of risk. I was already at Brown. I had sort of gotten the nod from my chair that this wasn't just absolutely ending my chances at tenure completely. Well, I'm not, it was a little riskier, but it seemed worth it.
The thing that I really love as far as the writing goes is how you interject yourself into the book, because that's, for me, that was the hook. I mean, that made me care. I mean, I was already interested in it because I thought it was cool because, I watched Deadly as Catch. But like, we're the crabs, man. Where is Sig Hansen like chain smoking like 4 packs a day in your book? I was like, oh God, you guys smell awful.
Awful.
Like, oh my God.
You got to cover up that
these boys are
crab
rough.
smell somehow, man.
It's okay. Going back, because just so we can go ahead and get sidetracked again. I remember before I flunked out of college the first time when I was at Murray State University, like I would see like in 1996, like I would see all of these like ads on the walls. Summer job.
Yes.
Come work at the cannery. Come work at do all this stuff. Like Alaska was calling you, and I so sometimes wish. I mean, I would have gotten eaten alive. Like I was utterly unprepared for that. They'd kill 46-year-old Jason, right? But that's just because all of my bones don't operate anymore, and all my tendons sound like an orchestra when I stand
stiff
up.
in the morning.
Yeah, pretty much like this is past your prime with Jason. Anyway, so I for me, the thing I loved about reading this, and I felt like what really drew me in, was you interjecting yourself into these stories. And I feel like that's the kind of histories I really read. And there are other, we kind of name dropped some other people earlier who do some other stuff. That to me personalizes it, and for me raises the stakes in which I read this. Like, there are relationships here. You are telling me how this place, not how it operates, but how it feels. And I felt like that really, for me, that's how I wanted to write. And you're not the only scholar I've read do this, but you're among the few. And I would say, like, there are a few, I don't mean to embarrass you, but like as capable at this. And that's the reason why I'm like, read this book with Jason time as well. So, I want to ask you this though. You talk a little bit about this, about being an outsider, and you were talking about your relationships with Native communities in Alaska, in Alaska up there, and I'm wondering, like, did was that something you had to wrestle with as far as like, hey, I'm not a member of this community. Can I write this story? Is this okay? Mm-hmm. Did you have pushback inside the academy as far as like, say, because there are folks who say, hey, only certain people should only be writing this, X, Y, Z. Certainly something I've wrestled with in the past. What was that experience like? Is that a thing that you had to kind of internalize and conceptualize? Like, how do you feel about that?
That's such a good question. And I mean, I wrestle with it constantly, and I think that that's good, right? I don't think you ever want to be like, yeah, I've completely figured this thing that's about relating to lots of other people through historically and contemporarily complicated political situations. And I think, part of where I kind of came out in wrestling and floating coast was that every single one of these communities that I talk about in this book have generations of local and regional historians who know that local and regional history in a way that I never will. And they do not need me to come in there and say anything about it at all, right? Like, I'm completely useless in that particular situation. And that where I have some utility is actually at scale and in doing, work that is deeply indebted to and drawing on those local histories, and they're all through here, right? And sometimes I sort of made a choice in this book that I didn't really differentiate between academic historians and somebody like Anders Apasengok, who is a Yupik knowledge holder in his community and has published these amazing compendia of oral histories. Like, I just sort of cite them the same way, because to me, the work that people in his position are doing needs to be recognized as fundamentally equivalent and necessary in the same way as, the weird stuff I do. And in some ways far more vital than the weird stuff I do. So I draw on that work and then, try to connect it with archives and processes that are at a scale that is bigger than that local. And I don't mean bigger in a sense that bigger is better or more important. It's just different, right? And I think that that's where, the kind of classical academic historian training, where you go to lots of archives and you learn to sort of compile that stuff and get trained in how to work in those kind of imperial spaces and read them with a sufficiently jaundiced eye, hopefully, to put them in context, is useful because it can help situate what is happening locally inside these other processes that are happening in a big regional scale or sometimes at a global scale. And that's like, there are two processes that need each other, or at least I need the local in order to make that global story like real and function and analytically sound, and deeply indebted to it. And that, hopefully it contributes something back. And I know that, one way that this book is used is actually to train Park Service employees when they show up, on the Seward Peninsula, and, you need something to hand people to be like, well, here's at least a gloss on where to get started, right? It's not the end of that journey hopefully for people in that position, but it's a way of saying, this region is connected with Russia and has been for a long time. And this region does have this colonial history that the United States is responsible for in the present. And, here's where you kind of fit in that long chain of things.
That has to be so incredibly, like, I can't imagine, like, to be part of that conversation, to like say, hey, you're new here, read this, and you get to be part of it, say, hey, this is what I think, and so forth. You be part of that dialogue. I want to ask you, we'll flash back to the film for a second. We talked a little bit about being aghast at the whale slaughter, of the commercialization of this, and the first time we see the whale. And I'm trying to conceptualize now for people who are listening in now, where we talk about like whale hunting and things like that globally, right? And how do I reckon with how I feel about how I want to support Indigenous people and Indigenous traditions and Indigenous customs, right? Because I am very vested in this. I want to support traditional lifeways. This is important to me. It's what I've built my own, not just my career route, but I really think in a lot of ways who I am as a person at this point in my life, right? At the same time, we were talking earlier about the sentience of whales, how whales feel. Frankly, how I feel about whales. How do we come to terms with say commercial, like saying, wait, I don't like commercial whaling. I don't like the death of whales. I don't like the harvesting of whales. At the same time, I want to appreciate the need, because so many indigenous communities depend upon the harvest, consumption, processing of whales. How do I reckon with that?
It's a good question. And it's one that I've talked with lots of people about since this book came out. I think the kind of first order thing to differentiate is the scale of commercial whaling versus the scale of indigenous whaling, which are just in two completely different realms from each other. So the kind of ecological estimates done by people who can do this kind of population modeling are that, historically, i.e. before the commercial whaling period, maybe 100 whales a year died around the entire Bering Strait, right? Out of a population of bowheads that are over 20,000. So, human beings were roughly on par with orcas in terms of being risks to these whales, right? We were a predator, but we were not like a particularly remarkable one. Remarkable only because bowheads don't have that many predators. But commercial whaling, 100 whales is something that these fleets of ships could kill in a couple of days if they're having happy hunting. And so one of those obviously is putting extinction level pressure on whale species, and one of them isn't. So at that level, they're just such fundamentally different processes. And I think there's, underneath that, and kind of the reason, part of the reason why Yupik and Inupiaq and other indigenous communities are so careful and so restrained in the way that they're hunting is that the reasons for hunting are so incredibly different, and the understanding of what's even happening in that moment that, commercial hunters, and we see a little bit of that in this movie, are motivated because they don't get paid unless they come back with a hold full of whale oil that they can sell. And they're paid as a percentage of that sale. And that's what they call a lay in this movie. That's what they called it historically. So they have every incentive to kill as many whales as they can, as fast as they can, because these are not fun places to live and work, these whale ships. Whereas if you're a Yupik hunter, the understanding of the whales is that they are moral sentient beings that are paying attention to you and your community and what you and your community are doing, and that they will only allow themselves to even be hunted if your behavior is sufficiently morally upstanding. And it's an act of supplication, not of domination, and one of necessity rather than one of kind of extraction. And I think that those relationships matter because they, one of them is sort of acknowledging that human beings have a role in the ecosystems that they live in, right? And it's not necessarily a destructive one, but it is one that requires human beings to eat something in order to not die. And commercial whaling wasn't even killing whales for food. It was killing whales so that people could burn whale oil and wear whalebone corsets. So that to me is where I come down on it. It's not absolutist enough for some folks, right? Some people think any whale death is too many. And I think that runs the risk of extinguishing a form of relationship, which, if you take seriously the way that Yupik and Inupiaq whale hunters understand the whales that they're hunting, is actually a relationship that's based on consent on the part of the whales. And I know that that's also a lot for, some audiences like genuinely can't go there. And that's, we all come from somewhere, so I understand that. But I personally am definitely not in the business of telling people that like that way of relating to the world is something that should end, because I think differently as a kid from Iowa.
No, but as a kid from Iowa, or as a kid from Kentucky, I think you and I probably come from fairly similar backgrounds all the way as far as hunters and things like that, who are believe in the ethical harvest of animals. And I was always taught that white-tailed deer give themselves to the hunter. Right? It is a sacrifice that these animals are making on the part of the cycle. So it's like, I get it, right? It pains me.
Yeah.
And, I've hunted before, right? I've killed animals. I've never felt good in the moment.
Yeah.
There's always this moment for me, at least, of hunting and harvesting an animal that it's like solemn.
It is solemn. Yeah, I think that is a good word. And that's been my experience being around any hunter that I would go back out in the woods with, I would say, is somebody who, or on the water with, is somebody for whom that is solemn. And it's a community responsibility if you're, a whaling captain in a contemporary indigenous village around the Bering Strait, right? It's a position of enormous responsibility and duty, and in some ways taking the the moral work of going out and killing an animal.
There's a kinship, a relationship. And I think that's really maybe, obviously, because, again, commercial hunting versus what you're talking about here is two radically different.
Yeah.
It's two different planets. I have a confession to make, which is the whole time we're talking, I'm seeing all these books behind you. And I don't know if you did the same thing or if you continue to do the same thing. When I visit professor friends or when I was in graduate school and I would go sit in the office, right?
Like, what are you
and you're talking, but you're just like...
No, I do that all the time. Get really distracted.
And oh my gosh, right? Because I'm like, I want that book so bad, right? And like I'm seeing that Salmon book behind you. And I'm like, wait a second, is that Kurlansky? What is that? So I'm like... I'm wondering, are there books that have influenced your work as a scholar or that you're reading now that are just like blowing your mind?
Oh, good question. I feel like those are two different categories.
Go for it. Give me two different categories. Take your subject and divide it into smaller categories. Just like,
as I was trained to do.
You know how to do this. Yeah, totally. Do you have like stuff that really influenced your stuff and stuff that maybe that you're reading now that you're like, oh, this shit's good?
Yes. You know? So I think the influential books, and this is like the least original thing ever, but I went to Berkeley, as I said, and I was in like my first year of graduate school and taking a U.S. survey graduate seminar, and one of the books on there was Don Worster's Rivers of Empire. And I read that and I was like, oh, these are my people. Like I didn't know anyone was actually thinking about this. Which is extremely embarrassing because Carl Jacobi was my undergraduate thesis advisor, and I don't know how I missed the memo, but I really did. So I didn't. That was like my sort of gateway to environmental history. And because I was at Berkeley, I ended up reading. I was sort of an autodidact in the field in some ways, and ended up spending a lot of time with kind of the OG classics in the field. So I think, Bill Cronin, particularly the chapter on lumber in Nature's Metropolis, was really influential, partly because of how he talks about energy. Richard White, even though he sort of negged me into writing this book, was influential. Bless him.
You were the second person who has dropped the term negging today, and I feel like we're going to have a whole thing about dudes like gaslighting women into dating. Like this is a whole other thing. What was I read that book, the one that's about back in the
Organic Machine,
the negging book.
Oh, the negging book. Yes, yeah.
I've read the Organic Machine like a few months ago on a flight just because I wanted to go back. The pickup artist or something like that.
The Game, I think it's called.
Yeah, The Game. Oh, you've read
Fascinating.
By Neil Strauss.
Totally.
He's a great writer.
Totally fascinating. Amazing case of somebody like writing a book about something that they loathe but can't look away from. Like, yeah.
Can I tell you? I had the frosted tips in the 2000s. I did the thing. I was like, it's like, wait a second. Utterly unattractive, terrible human beings who need to get dates.
Here you go.
Hi.
A manual.
I'm your audience. Right? Sorry. All right. So go ahead. Sorry.
But fortunately for you, it was a phase. This is critical. Critical.
Yeah. And then I started talking about the Columbia River and damming in the Pacific Northwest. All right, Richard White, certainly, right?
So there's that sort of whole group who are super. That sort of showed me that this field existed. I think when I was actually writing, particularly when I was doing the dissertation to book process, I just had a copy of Moby Dick that was on the desk, and I didn't read it back to front, but I sort of looked at it all the time because. Partly because I think Melville uses verbs better than your average English language user. And because he's so good at putting readers down in situations that are completely unfamiliar to them, but fascinating and compelling ways. So I had that kind of relationship with Moby Dick. There's an Inupiaq poet named Joan Nevaeh Kane, who I read a lot in that same period, partly because her use of language, alongside Melville's, they kind of grind against each other productively. And she sometimes is in open conversation with Melville, in a way that was really interesting for me I feel like I read poetry as a total dilettante. I don't understand how it works. I know when I like it or don't, but I couldn't possibly write about it. But I find it extremely useful to read as a way of sort of getting my brain shook out of whatever rut it's in at the time.
Yeah.
I think those books, and then a book by Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell called The Cultural Lives of Whales and Dolphins. They're both marine biologists and make this very marine biologist-y argument for the ways in which whales and dolphins have culture. And so this was like, it was permission, basically, like spending all this time with the, indigenous understanding of whales, which for, culture being sort of obvious, right? But knowing that I had to try to like get this across to audiences for whom that might be harder to take. This book did so much work for me in that way, right? It was like permission on steroids.
Are you familiar with Rick McIntyre's The Wolves of Yellowstone series?
Yes. Yeah.
Feels like the same.
Similar.
Feels like same alley.
Same alley, right? Talking about wolves having tradition, right, and using those words with such precision, right? It's not. There's nothing loose.
Fascinating reads.
Totally fascinating. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Similar vein. So I would say those were like the books that kind of were humming around in the background of this. The whole time.
And what are you digging now? Is there stuff? I mean, I know that you're busy writing and you're teaching and things like that. So I talk to my friends. I'm like, "What are you reading?" And I'm like, "Oh, why are you asking
what is the book?"
I'm grading. Oh my gosh, yes.
So I'm reading. I think I might have read parts of this when I was an overly annoyingly precocious teenager. But I'm rereading William Least Heat Moon's Prairie Earth, which is like a ginormous book.
Oh my goodness!
That's like older than I am, I think. When was it published?
It looks like brought
Oh no, yeah, 1991. Not older than I am, but and it's beautiful. I mean, it's just like it's called A Deep Map. That's the subtitle, which I like as a concept for what I'm thinking about now. And it's just stunning prose. I just read a book by oh my gosh, why is my brain failing me right at this very moment? Bryce Upholt. Called The Great River, which is it's a history of the Mississippi, which is coming out in June. So I read this in the galleys. So like mark your calendars. It's good. Yeah. And it's part of what was inspiring to me about it is that he managed to write a book about a very large and very, very complicated river that is not 5,000 pages long. I'm trying to write a book about the Yukon, and I'm very worried about it being 5,000 pages long. But this is like a sort of really interesting way of thinking about the Mississippi and what it has become, particularly the lower river, kind of as a larger meditation on our relationship with the environments we live in, but goes into all these complicated racial histories and economic histories. So I like that book a lot. And then, I mean, I'm usually listening to an audiobook that is, not remotely scholarly reputable in any way. I like finally joined the Tana French, these like Irish crime stories bandwagon, because I need something to listen to when I do the dishes.
Don't you feel like, at least I feel like a few years ago, I was talking to my best buddy from Iowa, and I was like, I finished my dissertation. I don't want to talk about Florida or cattle
right,
or anything else anymore, right? I'm like, I just want to read Hemingway. I just want to go back and do stuff. He's like, I'll read it with you, right? And then we started talking to a buddy of ours was like, I'll read in. And another friend was like, yeah, I'll jump in. I was like, did we just form a book club? Is that what we like? And so the book club is now called the Good, Hard, and True Book Club.
Oh, I love it.
Hemingway writes, right? But I found it was so necessary to completely reset my brain to think about something else. Go read. You were talking about poetry.
Yes.
To intellectually recalibrate the brain to think, write, feel the stuff that we do.
Totally. And I think there's all sorts of, I mean, I think in poetry, it's what is the language doing? And in, when I listen to a mystery novel, I'm like, these are people who know how to plot, right? And they know how to get a character across. And, often as a historian, you can't make up details. So sometimes sketching those characters is harder, but technically I think we're not supposed to do that. But even just to see like what are the details that make this person feel real to me, And if I find those, I should probably use them. And I feel like a lot of that for me comes from reading fiction.
You talked about this history. Is that the sequel? Is that what's coming up next? Are you allowed to talk about like the next project? Are you still envisioning what's happening with you?
So I'm in the high grasses phase of the second project. So I'm accumulating vast quantities of archival and other sorts of information, and trying to write an environmental history of the Yukon watershed, which sounded really great when I wrote a grant for it right before the pandemic. And I hadn't actually looked at a map, and I didn't realize that the Yukon watershed, you can put all of Texas and all of California in this watershed, and there's a couple Rhode Islands left over. It's a very large territory. And so now I'm like, okay. I mean, I thought the Bering Strait was big, but actually it is really not compared to like the dimensions of this and how many different ecologies and how many different indigenous societies. And anyway, that's where I'm worried about this being a 10,000 page book. But it's giving me life in so many ways, partly because I convinced said granting organization to fund me to take trips on the Yukon River. So I spent a big chunk of 2022 on the Yukon. And then last summer, I went about 1,300 miles of it. And then this summer, I'm doing another chunk. Some of them I'm doing over more than once. I've run chunks of it by dog sled. I'm calling this research. It's very rigorous, I promise. And then connecting those with lots of archives.
But isn't it though? I mean, if you're an environmental historian, you cannot write these histories from an office in Rhode Island.
I can't. I think there are people who can, but I can't. I mean, it just there's something about being able to see the place and having a sense of how it's lived in now that feels to me like part of the method of understanding the past of it.
You can't translate the feeling to a reader.
Yeah.
Unless you were there and you could feel it. And like you have these reflections, which I'm hoping we'll see more of in this next book that will be out in 2047.
Probably.
According to the size of your scope here.
Goal. I like realistic goals. My editor sends me emails 91? And she's like, where's that proposal? And I'm like,
Yeah, I have other stories for you. All right. Do you have students at Brown, are they talking about the same kind of stuff? Do you find them deviating largely from your own work? Like, one of the things I'm fascinated about is I'm always kind of curious about like genealogical trees, academically speaking, right? Like, how does my advisor's work affect my own? Does my work affect somebody else? Things like, do you find your own students also kind of asking the same questions? Are they also interested in the Yukon? Do they come to you and say, hey, I want to do this area? Or are they doing other cool shit elsewhere? I've got to imagine they're doing cool stuff.
That's a great question. I have 2 grad students right now where I'm the primary advisor, one of whom is working on an amazing dissertation that the subject actually came up earlier. His name's Max Bridge, or their name is Max Bridge. And their dissertation is looking at the sonic lives of whales and like how people came to know whales and dolphins through sound, and the kind of recordings in the oceans and the whole kind of history of science, but also the environmental history behind kind of figuring out how it is that these species, we've related to each other basically sonically, which is cool stuff, which is like, you can see where it touches what I've done, but it is definitely going off in its own great direction, which is exactly what you want, right? And I have another student named Victor Naranjo who's working on history of Alaskan airspace and thinking about the kind of verticality in the atmosphere as a kind of colonial space because of the intense military presence and particularly Air Force presence in Alaska, because it's so strategically important if you're trying to bomb Russia. And that's another one where it's like, that's, we have this like point of contact, but that project is taking off.
You know what? Well, going back to Josh's stuff about like the idea of the sea as space, and then now the idea of space is space, and now I'm thinking about Holly Guys' stuff.
Yes. Oh my God, such a good book.
Do you know Holly?
Yo, I totally know Holly. Yes. Yeah, I love Holly.
I got to see her recently. She's one of my most favorite people, not in academia, but just
as a person
on planet.
Totally.
She's coming on. We figured out she's doing Edward Scissorhands for her book. For her movie.
I actually had thought, I was like, what is a book that Holly and I could do together? Not a book, a movie. You can tell that it's my bedtime. I'll keep thinking.
You guys want to come on to do some together? Like, all you have to do is say when.
Okay, because it would be so fun.
So, yes. Okay. It is coming on your bedtime. So let's circle back to this film and come back to maybe our final question here, which is In the Heart of the Sea a history movie?
Yes. And I think it's a history movie, not just because it clearly takes place in the 19th century and everybody's wearing 19th century clothes and pretending to have 19th century accents.
Are they? Chris Hemsworth's
or some kind of accent.
Is he even trying?
I don't know what's happening there.
Whatever.
Maybe this was like a bridge movie as he was, working on just a straight American accent. I don't know.
He'll be Thor one day.
But I think actually something you said about if there was a sort of historians at the movies recut of it, that it would be useful to teach with. And I think partly for the things that it gets right. And then partly, I'm always struck when I watch a movie that's about a piece of history I know something about all of the things that it identifies that I don't know anything about. Like, I don't actually know what these whalers said to each other on those whaleboats. Like, nobody was going back and putting in the log, multiple lines of dialogue. If it ever shows up, it's because it was an incredibly exceptional day, or somebody blasphemed so badly that they got in trouble with the captain, or it's not the quotidian, like, what did you guys yell at each other? What was the slang like? I mean, you get like hints of it, but so I feel like you know that it's not accurate in a sort of one-to-one sense, but it's also useful in terms of identifying the things that we don't know.
Yeah, totally, right? Like, and that sometimes that's our work as a scholar too, right? It's like, this isn't in the archive, this isn't apparent, but this is what I think is happening. This is like what I would imagine people would talk about on the open sea as they're being hunted by.
Right? Yeah.
We're being hunted by a giant white whale that wants to kill us. We're all gonna die. Right. We're all there's no water, and I'm surrounded by Spider-Man and Thor. I am definitely going to get chosen for cannibalism.
That's right. Your number is up.
I'm going to die here. I do not have a multi-year deal.
These are like historically good-looking people. I'm going to die. That's the...
Right. It's like, I will sacrifice for your gene pool, for all of society. All right. Where can people find you online? Like, when people know more about your work, where do people go?
I used to be on the site known as Twitter, but I sort of left it because it has devolved into what it has, which is very sad. And I actually miss it a lot. I made so many amazing...
It's the Essex.
It is the Essex. That's right. And that would make Elon Musk Moby Dick. It's not a terrible analogy there.
No, I'm rooting for. No, yeah, I'm rooting for the whale. I'm sorry.
Or is he Ahab?
Yeah, but go on.
Anyway,
he's definitely Ahab.
But I'm on Instagram.
Looks like Baron Harkonnen.
That is really true. I wonder if those costume designers were like, what we could do here, just like.
Now that chance is in my head. All right, I'm sorry. Go on. You were saying by another social media, by someone who's totally not awful.
Right,
go on.
Right, because those are out there. I'm on the Meta platforms. Instagram at BR Demuth. That's usually my handle everywhere. That's my website, brdemuth.com. Also, my name is highly unusual, so it's very easy to just Google me.
There aren't many.
There are not many. So.
I feel like, no. Have I ever seen your name before?
I've never met another living Bathsheba.
Have you met a dead Bathsheba?
I mean, there's a very famous...
That would be an even more compelling story.
It would be. I was thinking of like the very famous biblical one, but...
Well, yeah, but I was like, have you ever... You're like, I've never met a living one. I'm like, shit, what do you do at night? So...
There's a gravestone of a Bathsheba in southern Rhode Island who's quite infamous because she was meant to have killed her whole family with an axe and then gone on to haunt things. So that's actually the not living Bathsheba I had in mind.
What, was she tired of writing about watersheds? Was that what happened?
Right. She's like, she had it.
She's like, I'm out.
Hopefully, I will see the signs in advance of that.
Yes. All right. Bathsheba Demuth, thank you so much for being here for reading, because I was so excited to talk to you. And I have to tell you, sometimes when I come to do these pods, I have to kind of work myself up because I'm super tired at the end of the day and stuff like that. I was looking forward to talking to you all day long, even though we had to talk about this movie that no one's going to watch or even remember. We won't remember it tomorrow.
We'll do better next time.
This is the best time talking to you. This is our first conversation, talk, and I'm so happy we did.
No, same. Thank you so much, Jason. This was great.
And And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Bathsheba Demuth. You are just the best, and that was the most fun. I was looking forward to this conversation. It was everything I hoped it would be. So I hope if you're listening here, you enjoyed it as much. I hope that you go out and buy her book, Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait. It's such a great book. I can't say that enough. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this podcast happen. Fletcher stitches all this stuff together. He edits it out. He literally texted me right now asking me, was that the boat movie? Yes, Fletcher, that was indeed the boat movie. So thank you so much to Fletcher for making this show happen. But more than anything else, thank you to all of you for making this show happen. This show does not happen without you continuing to share it with your friends, your family, your strangers, and everyone else. Your enthusiasm for HATM keeps this community going, keeps me going. And it means the world to me. So I hope you all understand that. So we've got a whole bunch more really cool pods coming for you soon. If you would like to sponsor the pod, we are now in the position of accepting sponsorships. So just reach out to me at historiansofthemovies@gmail.com and we'll set you up. No offer is too great. You can overpay. It's just fine with us. But thank you so very much for being here. It is my great privilege and delight to continue to bring this podcast to you, and we will continue to do so. So, that being said, ciao for now. Bye.